A woman stands at a podium in Los Angeles, 50 years old now, and the question the room wants answered has nothing to do with the award in her hand. It has to do with a man she has known since she was 21, a man the entire world once insisted she was secretly in love with. For almost 30 years, Kate Winslet has fielded that question in one form or another, in interviews and profiles, in whispered tabloid speculation that refused to die no matter how many times she denied it. And now, past the milestone of 50, she has finally spoken about Leonardo DiCaprio with a clarity that leaves very little room for fantasy fans have been nursing since 1997. What she said was not a scandal. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more revealing than any secret romance could have been, an answer built not on denial, but on decades of lived history between two people who chose friendship over the version of themselves the public wanted to imagine. To understand why that answer matters, it helps to go back to where Kate Winslet came from, long before Rose DeWitt Bukater existed in anyone's imagination. She was born on the 5th of October, 1975, in Reading, England, into a family where performing was less a glamorous ambition than a practical trade passed down like any other skill. Her father, Roger Winslet, worked as a jobbing actor who supplemented uncertain theater wages with laboring work, and her mother took on jobs as a nanny and a waitress to keep the household steady. Her grandparents on her mother's side had run a repertory theater in Reading, so the stage was never a distant, mythical place for young Kate. It was simply where the adults in her family went to earn a living, and where she was taken along almost as a matter of course, watching rehearsals from the wings before she was old enough to understand what she was watching. Money was often scarce in the Winslet household. When Kate was 10, her father was seriously injured in a boating accident, which made steady work even harder to come by for a man who already depended on unpredictable acting jobs. Kate has spoken in later interviews about how her childhood, despite the financial strain, felt full of warmth rather than deprivation, and that the emotional security her parents provided became the foundation that allowed her to keep chasing an unlikely career even when the odds against it seemed obvious to everyone but her. She was performing almost as soon as she could stand in front of an audience, appearing in a school nativity play at 5 years old. And by her early teens, she had enrolled at the Red Roof Theater School in Maidenhead, a stage school known for placing children in professional auditions around London, competing against far more experienced kids for the smallest of parts. School itself was not kind to her outside of those rehearsal rooms. Kate has described being bullied as a child because of her appearance, an experience that would resurface with cruel irony once she became famous and faced criticism of her body on a global scale rather than a schoolyard one. At 16, financial pressure forced her to leave Red Roofs, and rather than treating that as the end of the dream, she simply kept working, taking a job at a delicatessen while she continued auditioning between shifts. Her first real screen credit came through the BBC science fiction series Dark Season in 1991, a modest start that gave no hint of what was coming, and for a while longer she remained exactly what she had always been, a determined teenager slicing meat behind a counter and hoping the next audition might be the one that mattered. The real turning point arrived in 1994, when she won the role of Julia Hume in Peter Jackson's Heavenly Creatures, beating out roughly 175 other young actresses for the part. The film, based on a real and disturbing 1954 murder case in New Zealand, required Kate to research trial records and personal letters connected to the case, and she has said the immersion made it difficult to leave the character behind at the end of each day, a demand that would have overwhelmed a less committed young performer. Critics took notice immediately, and the role opened the door to Sense and Sensibility, where Emma Thompson was impressed enough by Kate's audition to expand what had originally been envisioned as a smaller part into the substantial role of Marianne Dashwood. Under Ong Lee's direction, that performance earned Kate a BAFTA, a Screen Actors Guild Award, and her first Academy Award nomination, all before she had turned 21, a run of recognition that few actresses her age had ever managed in such quick succession. Then came Titanic, and with it, a level of fame that nothing in Kate Winslet's career up to that point could have prepared her for. James Cameron has spoken about the casting process in interviews over the years, describing how he initially had reservations about Kate, partly because her run of period dramas had made her, in his own half-joking words, something like typecast as a corset actress. Gwyneth Paltrow was among the other names considered for Rose. But once Cameron met with Kate directly, Her intensity convinced him she could carry the emotional weight the role demanded, a young woman suffocating under the expectations of her class and her family, desperate for a version of life she had not yet been allowed to imagine for herself, and willing to reach for it even at the cost of everything familiar. The other half of that casting puzzle was Leonardo DiCaprio, already an accomplished young actor with an Academy Award nomination of his own for What's Eating Gilbert Grape. According to accounts Cameron has given publicly, DiCaprio arrived expecting a straightforward meeting rather than a screen test, and initially pushed back at being asked to read opposite Kate on camera. Cameron held firm, reportedly telling him plainly that he was not willing to gamble 2 years of production on a casting decision he had not tested for himself. DiCaprio agreed to the screen test, and by Cameron's own description, the moment the cameras rolled, something shifted. The chemistry between the two actors was immediate and unmistakable, not manufactured through editing, but visible in the room itself. And it settled the question of who would play Jack and Rose almost before anyone had finished watching the footage back. What followed was a production that pushed both actors to their physical limits. Long hours in water tanks in Baja California, injuries, illness, and exhaustion that Kate has described candidly in later interviews, recalling weeks that blurred together under freezing conditions and a shooting schedule that stretched far beyond what anyone had originally planned. When Titanic was released in December of 1997, it became a cultural event on a scale almost no one anticipated, eventually earning more than $2 billion worldwide and sweeping 11 Academy Awards, a haul that tied the record for the most wins in Oscar history. Kate, at 22, received her first Best Actress nomination. She had gone, in the span of a single film, from a respected young actress with a handful of acclaimed credits to one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, a transition so abrupt that she has said it took years to fully process. That transformation came at a cost that has taken Kate decades to speak about with full honesty. She has described the period after Titanic as one in which her privacy essentially disappeared overnight, replaced by a level of media attention that focused disproportionately on her appearance rather than her work. The infamous public debate over whether Jack and Rose could have both fit on the floating door became, absurdly, a pretext for tabloids to scrutinize her body, and Kay has recalled that even people within the industry treat her weight as a professional matter, with her agent reportedly fielding calls asking about it directly. She was 21 when the film was shot, still developing the confidence and boundaries most people are allowed to build in private, and she has since called that scrutiny a form of bullying that she believes younger actresses today are, thankfully, less willing to simply absorb in silence the way her generation so often had to. What made that period particularly disorienting, by Kate's own account, was how little of it had anything to do with acting. She had spent years working toward a career built on craft, on research, on the kind of preparation she brought to heavenly creatures in sense and sensibility. And suddenly the conversation around her had almost nothing to do with any of that. Interviewers wanted to know about her body, her love life, her friendship with her famous co-star, rarely her process or her choices as a performer. In response, rather than chasing the biggest available paychecks in the years immediately following Titanic, she deliberately gravitated towards smaller, more challenging independent films, a decision that confused some observers at the time, but which she has since described as essential to holding on to the version of herself that existed before the world decided it already knew who she was. Leonardo DiCaprio's experience of sudden fame took a different shape, but carried its own weight. He became, almost overnight, a magazine cover heartthrob, an image that had little to do with the serious, character-driven work he had built his early career around. He has spoken about how disorienting it was to have his personal life become public property in a way that had nothing to do with acting, describing the years immediately after Titanic as a period in which he felt more like a product being marketed than an actor being hired for his work. Rather than lean into the romantic lead image the public wanted from him, he deliberately pursued riskier, less commercially safe projects in the years that followed, a pattern that traces back even further to his decision as a teenager to take the smaller, more demanding role in What's Eating Gilbert Grape over a more lucrative opportunity, simply because he wanted to work with Robert De Niro's production and with a director he respected. It is against this backdrop of shared, disorienting fame that the real foundation of Kate and Leo's friendship becomes easier to understand. They met on the Titanic set at 21 and 22 years old, and by Kate's own account, the connection between them was almost instantaneous, not romantic tension, but an easy, teasing camaraderie more typical of childhood friends and movie stars playing history's most famous doomed couple. She has described their off-camera dynamic as goofy and unguarded, full of the kind of teasing, wrestling, and joking around that made the demanding shoot bearable, the two of them behaving, in her words, like a pair of kids who happen to have wandered onto a very expensive film set. Kate has said she wondered, before meeting him, whether she would find him intimidating or whether he might see her as too serious. Instead, she found someone she could be completely unself-conscious around, and that ease, rather than any spark of romance, became the actual bedrock of their relationship. That distinction between the chemistry required for a role and reality of two people's private feelings is one Kate has returned to repeatedly over the years when never asked about the persistent dating rumors. She has explained that on camera, she could fully surrender to what Rose felt for Jack, allowing the fictional attraction to feel completely real in the moment, while walking away from set each day simply as herself, with Leonardo remaining exactly what had always been to her, a close friend rather than an object of romantic interest. She has described the idea of the two of them actually dating as something closer to absurd than exciting, at one point comparing the notion to something like a sibling relationship, a comment that, however blunt, captured how thoroughly she saw him as family rather than a romantic prospect. It is a distinction that professional actors make more often than audiences tend to appreciate, the ability to generate convincing intimacy on camera, without any of it bleeding into life off camera, and Kate has suggested that the trust required to do that convincingly is itself a form of intimacy, just not the romantic kind fans have spent decades hoping for. Their bond was tested in an unusual way more than a decade after Titanic, when they reunited for Revolutionary Road, playing a married couple whose relationship is collapsing under disappointment and resentment. The film required far darker, more intimate scenes than anything in Titanic, made stranger still by the fact that the director, Sam Mendes, was Kate's husband at the time. Kate has spoken about how surreal that overlap felt, filming emotionally raw scenes with her best friend while her husband directed from behind the camera, and has recounted Leonardo essentially telling her to push through the discomfort rather than dwell on it. A piece of blunt, practical advice that she has said was exactly what she needed to hear in the moment. That the friendship survived such an unusual professional entanglement, including scenes that require both of them to portray a marriage disintegrating in real time, says something about how sturdy the underlying trust between them had already become by that point. Public fascination with their bond found one of its most quoted moments at the 2009 Golden Globe Awards, when Kate won for both Revolutionary Road and The Reader. During her acceptance speech, cameras caught Leonardo watching her with visible pride, and Kate, addressing him directly from the stage, spoke about how much she had come to love him over the 13 years they had known each other by that point. Clips of that moment have circulated for years, often stripped of context and read as evidence of a secret romance, when in reality it reflected exactly what Kate has always said about their relationship, a deep, long-standing platonic love built on more than a decade of genuine friendship rather than concealed attraction. The moment became, in a strange way, a perfect illustration of the gap between how the public wanted to interpret their bond and how the two of them actually understood it themselves. That trust extended well beyond film sets and award shows. When Kate married Ned Rock'n'Roll in 2012, Leonardo was reportedly present to walk her down the aisle during their private ceremony, a detail that speaks to how thoroughly he had become part of her actual life rather than remaining a colleague she saw only on set. Years later, when DiCaprio finally won his long-awaited Academy Award for The Revenant in 2016, after decades of nominations without a win and no small amount of public anticipation building around whether it would finally happen, Kate's visible emotion watching him receive it read as the reaction of someone genuinely invested in her friend's happiness, not performance of cameras. Those small cumulative moments, a wedding, an award ceremony, decades of overlapping careers, tell a more convincing story about the nature of their bond than any single tabloid headline ever could. It is in more recent interviews, given as Kate has passed 50, that she has spoken about all of this with the most direct honesty, rather than deflecting the question with a joke or a vague denial, as she often did in earlier decades of her career. She has explained plainly why she believes a friendship endured precisely because romance was never part of it. She has said that Leonardo related to her more like one of the guys and a potential partner, and that she never saw herself as particularly girly in a way that might have invited a different dynamic between them. Rather than treating this as a disappointing answer for fans who wanted a real-life Jack and Rose, Kate has framed it as the actual explanation for why their bond has lasted 3 decades without the complications that romantic relationships between famous former co-stars so often carry. Complications she has watched play out in other high-profile friendships that did not survive the transition from professional partnership to something more. Leonardo, for his part, has echoed that sentiment in his own public comments over the years, describing Kate as among his closest and most trusted friends, someone whose opinion he values precisely because their relationship was never clouded by romantic expectation. What emerges from both of their accounts, taken together, is not a story of suppressed feelings finally admitted after decades of hiding, but something more grounded, a friendship that has quietly outlasted both of their marriages' careers and the enormous shadow cast by the film that made them famous in the first place. It is worth noting how rare the kind of longevity actually is in an industry built on shifting alliances and short-lived collaborations, where co-stars who seem inseparable during a press tour often drift apart within a few years once the promotional obligations end. It is worth pausing on just how unusual it is for two people to spend 3 decades in the public eye without their friendship curdling into something more complicated, whether that complication takes the shape of rivalry, resentment, or the kind of quiet distance that so often develops once two careers start moving at different speeds. Kate's path after Titanic wound through prestige dramas, character-driven independent films, and eventually television work that pushed her into entirely new territory, including her Emmy-winning performance in Mayor of Easttown, a role that had nothing to do with the glamour audiences associated with her early career, and everything to do with the kind of unglamorous, deeply human storytelling she had always gravitated toward when given the choice. Leonardo, meanwhile, built an entirely different kind of career, one defined by long collaborations with directors like Martin Scorsese, environmental advocacy that became essential to his public identity as his acting, and a selectivity about roles that turned him into one of the most consistently acclaimed leading men of his generation. Their careers rarely overlapped again after Revolutionary Road, yet the friendship apparently required no professional proximity to sustain itself, which is itself a kind of evidence for how genuine it actually was. There's also something worth noting in how differently each of them has handled the scrutiny that came with fame, choices that reveal as much about their friendship as any joint appearance ever could. Kate has spoken candidly, particularly in interviews given later in her career, about deliberately raising her children away from the more intense corners of celebrity culture, prioritizing ordinary experiences, and pushing back publicly against unrealistic beauty standards in the film and fashion industries, sometimes requesting that magazines refrain from digitally retouching her photographs. Leonardo, for his part, has largely kept his personal life shielded from the press while using his public platform almost exclusively for environmental causes, appearing before the United Nations and funding conservation projects through his foundation, rather than courting the kind of tabloid attention that once defined the years immediately following Titanic. Two very different strategies for surviving the same overwhelming fame, and yet both strategies seem to have left enough room for an old friendship to keep breathing quietly in the background, unbothered by the machinery of celebrity that surrounded each of their separate lives. None of this is to say the friendship has been without its own quieter, more human moments away from cameras and acceptance speeches. Kate has described ordinary things: phone calls during difficult periods, messages of support around career milestones, the kind of low-key contact that rarely makes headlines because there is nothing dramatic about it to report. It is precisely that lack of drama, ironically, that seemed to have been the point all along. A friendship built on constant public spectacle would likely have buckled under its own weight decades ago, the way so many celebrity pairings eventually do once the cameras move on to the next story. What Kate and Leonardo appear to have built instead is something closer to an ordinary friendship that happens to exist inside an extraordinary set of circumstances, sustained less by grand gestures than by decades of simply choosing, again and again, to remain part of each other's lives. That context makes Kate's recent comments feel less like a revelation in the tabloid sense, and more like a long overdue clarification, offered now with the confidence of someone who no longer feels obligated to manage public curiosity about her private relationships. Turning 50 appears to have given her a certain freedom to speak plainly about things she once deflected with humor, not because the truth has changed, but because her patience of question, after 3 decades of being asked it in one form or another, has simply run its course. She is no longer the 21-year-old fielding invasive questions about her body on a press tour, nor the young star cautiously managing her image in the years immediately after Titanic. She is a woman in her 50s with an accomplished, self-directed career, entirely capable of deciding what she does and does not owe public curiosity. And in this case, she has decided that honesty, however unglamorous compared to the fantasy, is worth more than continuing to let speculation fill the silence. There's a version of the story that fans wanted for almost 30 years, one where Jack and Rose's chemistry was real all along and simply waiting for the right moment to surface. Kate Winslet's answer, delivered now with perspective of 50 years and 3 decades of friendship behind her, quietly closes the door on that version for good. What she offered instead was something less cinematic, but, in its own way, harder to manufacture and rarer to find. Two people who met as strangers thrown into an extraordinary situation, who somehow managed to become each other's steadiest presence through fame, marriages, awards, and everything in between, without ever needing to fall in love to make that bond matter. Perhaps that is the real ending to the story audiences have been waiting for since 1997. Not a secret romance finally confirmed, but proof that some connections are strong enough to survive without one, and that the truest kind of loyalty is sometimes the kind that never asks to be anything more than exactly what it already was. Looking back across the arc of it all, from a bullied schoolgirl performing in a nativity play to a global icon standing on some of the biggest stages in the world, Kate Winslet's story has never really been about the fantasy other people projected onto her. It has been about the quieter, steadier choices she made underneath all of that noise, choosing smaller films when bigger paychecks were available, choosing honesty when silence would have been easier, and choosing to protect a friendship rather than let 3 decades of speculation define it for her. Leonardo DiCaprio's own story, running in parallel for most of that time, tells a similar version of the same lesson, that fame does not have to dictate who a person becomes, provided they are willing to keep making deliberate choices about who they let close and why. Together, their friendship stands as something audiences rarely get to see up close. Two enormously famous people who managed, against considerable odds, to keep one relationship in their lives simple, honest, and entirely their own, long after the world had already decided it knew exactly what that relationship was supposed to be.